thanks very much for, well, Julia, first of all, for inviting me and yeah, that excellent introduction. And for everybody who is attending, really appreciate you carving out the time from, I'm sure, you're very busy, COVID allowing lots of free, exciting activities in the evening, I'm sure. But yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, so I work for, as Julia said, two organizations, Centres Institute, which is where I guess most of the research I'm referring to in this presentation comes from my experience in that organization. And then I recently co-founded late last year a new nonprofit called Animal Advocacy Careers. Yeah, spent my time 2 days for one, 3 days for the other. So hopefully what we do will become a bit clearer over the course of this presentation. So Julia also gave an excellent introduction to effective altruism, so I'm not going to spend a long time talking about this, but yeah, I'll be using some terms related to this idea of effective altruism. Centres Institute and Animal Think Tank, Centres Institute and Animal Advocacy Careers, can't even say the name of my own organisations, are very much inspired by these principles of effective altruism. That is, we're trying to work out how to do the most good we can using our time resources as cost efficient as we can, essentially. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about this question of moral circle expansion, animal advocacy, and the long-term future. So to give a bit of context, I see humanity's moral circle as expanding. Here's a clear example of that sort of expansion. This is a picture representing the sugar boycott that was intended to put pressure on the institution of slavery in Great Britain, United Kingdom. So the British slave trade started in 1555, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and this boycott began in 1791, and the slave trade was actually abolished only a decade or so later after that pressure really started to mount in 1807, and then slaves were actually fully emancipated in the UK in 1833. So when I talk about the moral circle, I'm talking about this idea of the set of beings a given moral consideration, such as protection in society's laws or other ways being considered, essentially. So this is an example of some recent survey research looking at the concept of the moral circle, sometimes referred to as moral expansiveness, which is, I think it's really fascinating. You can see these different groups. Essentially, they had some different survey questions. Sorry, they had survey questions about different groups of entities, and they were grouped. So they didn't see, do you like villains or not? They saw the same question for murderers as they did for your family and that sort of thing, and then they were grouped and averaged. And this is how the spread looks like. You probably won't be surprised to see that people granted the most moral concern to their friends and family, and you can see as it sort of expands outwards, you've got stigmatized people somewhere in the middle, you've got various forms of animal further out, and right on the edge, you've got villains, which I found very surprising that they were granted less moral consideration than animals. But I'll come back to some of these results because I find them really interesting to talk about. So I think that continued moral circle expansion, this process, this sort of ongoing historical trend, is likely to continue. We've got a whole lot of historical precedents to suggest that the moral circle will continue to expand. If you think in the past few hundred years alone, this idea of the moral circle, the set of beings that are granted consideration and protection, right, is expanded to include women, where previously they were arguably excluded entirely or partly. It's expanded to include people in different countries, and people from different ethnicities. It's expanded increasingly to include people from the LGBTQI community, and in other ways too. In lots of ways, the moral circle has been expanding over the past few hundred years, and this gives me hope that it will continue to expand, essentially. There are a bunch of long-term trends that feed into this process that make me think it's fairly likely to continue. For example, these are the sorts of, if any of you have read the book by Steven Pinker, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he talks about some of these trends, things like changing scientific opinion and globalization, and some of these things seem to feed into and support the process of moral circle expansion. And those trends were kind of discussed by my colleague at Sentence Institute in his book he published a year or two ago called The End of Animal Farming and How They Apply. They also, I talk about some of these factors, these kind of long-term indirect trends that are encouraging continued moral circle expansion in a post I wrote called the very humble, small research project of how tractable is changing the course of history. I dived into that and looking at some historical evidence for it, and there's a section at the bottom about moral circle expansion specifically, and yeah, came to the conclusion that I think it's likely to continue to expand, basically. So you might be asking, okay, Jamie, why should we care? Why do we care about the moral circle? Why do we care about it continuing to expand? Well, you could care for a number of different reasons. You might see it as unfair that certain sets of beings, humans, right? Certain humans or beings are excluded from the moral circle. You might see it as a justice issue. We might see suffering among some types of being and think, okay, those beings are suffering and their interests are not sufficiently considered. So we need to expand humanity's moral circle to ensure that they are sufficiently considered. And maybe you take a different perspective. Maybe you just see this kind of ongoing historical trend and project and you want to be part of that, and you see that as humanity's great mission of the past few centuries and want to continue that. So basically, from a bunch of different philosophical perspectives, I think you could be supportive of this increasing humanity's moral circle. Yeah, so clearly, okay, this is both a terrible picture, and I made this presentation before the recent outbreak of Black Lives Matter stuff, so I definitely could have got a better picture for this. But clearly, I just want to put it at the start that there are lots of those groups I've discussed. Women increasingly being included, people from various ethnicities and countries increasingly being included. Those struggles are still ongoing, okay? There's definitely degrees of inclusion in the moral circle. And when I talk about some of the groups that are more or less excluded, I'm not intending to imply that these other groups are somehow like the struggle is over, they're fully included, or anything like that. Yeah, so going back to this survey research that I mentioned at the start that was conducted with some US citizens they're not citizens, but they were US participants anyway, online research, and by a bunch of psychologists essentially. And what I find, one of the things I found most shocking about this, apart from the villains thing just being interesting, is that if you look at some of the slightly more outer rungs, if you look at animals, you've got animals high sentience, and you've got the little picture of the chimpanzee there. And you've got animals low sentience, the picture of the chicken, and I think it was chickens, fish, and might have been insects, I can't remember, that they asked about. That's the three. And then nested in between, you've got environment. And I just find this absolutely astounding that and environmental targets included things like coral reefs. I just find it astounding that people would essentially assign greater moral consideration. The question basically says something along the lines of how much moral consideration, this is not the exact wording, do not quote it, how much moral consideration should we grant to these different entities? And people basically, on average, wanted to grant more consideration to coral reefs than they did to chickens. And I just find that, well, repulsive, basically. And yeah, I think it shows that there's still a case for, although arguably animals have been increasingly included in the moral circle in recent decades, if not centuries, there's still a long way to go to bring them closer towards the centre of that moral circle, and more of a distinction from the more obviously non-sentient beings that can't feel suffering or pain in the same way, like plants and coral reefs. Okay, so yeah, so this is, yeah, I've put this picture here to show that we've all seen these sorts of videos and images of factory farming. You can think of investigations by groups like Animal Equality, Open Cages, Mercy for Animals, shedding light on the experience that these animals have on a day-to-day basis in what we call factory farms. And yeah, when I say factory farms, most animals, and the vast majority of animals in the US at least, are kept in factory farms. And this is, I can't remember if this is US or UK, sorry, but this is a free range farm. And I just wanted to put the picture on there to show that it is not necessarily what you'd expect. life for these animals, by most people, I think, would conclude that life is not good for these animals. So what I'm getting at here is something to do with the idea of the scale and the size of factory farming and just the experience of those animals. There are, we're getting at the sense of the intensity of suffering that these animals have. And this is a graph from a website that is actually a website URL, which continues to astound me every time I do this talk, ethical.diet. You can look it up, and it has this graph on it, which is the number of hours on factory farms that are required to produce 2,000 calories for different food types. And if you imagine that for every 2,000 calories of eggs or chicken meat that people consume, it requires hundreds of hours of conditions like that, right? Hundreds of hours of what most people would conclude to be intense suffering. And when we think about not just as an individual animal perspective, but the perspective of the sheer number of beings that are experiencing these conditions, they are horrifying. If you just look at the this graph, this is from some research on Centers Institute's website on the number of animals in US factory farms alive at any one point, and you can see the number of meat chickens there on the right is, I'm just going to focus on that because it's so much larger than the others in the US, is 1.5, over 1.5 billion, right? These numbers are unimaginably high. When we think of an individual chicken, you know, that you can't even think about the experience of that many animals in that picture, let alone the huge number that are there. But the point I'm getting at is that the size of this problem is massive, right? And then if we think that it's not just the US, it's also the rest of the world and factory farming, the sheer number of animals. And so Centers Institute's estimate is that there are 23 billion, this was, I think, from 2019, 23 billion factory farmed land vertebrates alive at any one time. And if you count the number of fish as well, the number is far higher. So I'm getting at this kind of way that people in the effective altruism community tend to think about how important problems are, right, in terms of scale, so the size of the problem, okay? Another consideration is neglectedness. How much effort is actually going towards addressing these problems and expanding humanity's moral circle to include farmed animals? And the answer is not as much as you would hope for the size of the problem, essentially. Neglected problem. If we look at some of these stats, this is the number of dollars that Americans annually donate to various different causes. You see at the top there, 334 billion to various domestic causes like religious, educational issues. And if we jump down to the bottom, then we see 0.02 to 0.05 billion dollars to farmed animals issues. And that includes, actually, I can't remember what year these numbers are from, so I can't promise they're 100% up to date. But those numbers include welfare advocacy, vegetarian advocacy, and sanctuaries. And a lot of that money goes to sanctuaries. So, yeah. So these, I've gone through the consideration of scale, factory farming, big in scale, arguably really neglected. And sorry, I know that's US data, but it's a fairly similar picture in many other countries. And then on this last point, the last consideration that effective altruists tend to use to prioritize between causes is the consideration of tractability. Essentially, what can we actually do, if anything, about this problem? And for a number of reasons, I'm very optimistic that there is lots of work that can be done and lots of progress that can be made. This is essentially one of the most measurable interventions on a short-term time frame is corporate welfare campaigns. You can look and say, okay, these nonprofits put in this much effort with this number of sort of dollars of donation money, and they secured this number of pledges which appear to affect this number of animals. And my friend Saulus at Rethink Priorities did some research on this, and he came up with this broad estimate of corporate campaigns affect 9 to 120 years of chicken life per dollar spent. And that is a huge number of animals per dollar spent. It suggests that if this is a hugely tractable problem, we can make a difference at the very least on short-term timeframes. And yeah, I don't think it's limited to this. I'm just using it as an example of the sorts of of the idea that there is room for making progress on this issue, basically. So in brief summary of the things I've just been talking about, the problem of factory farming seems important, large in scale, it seems neglected, and it seems practical. There's opportunity for work in this space. And the implication of those three things together is that there are opportunities for cost-effective actions, right? You can input a certain amount of resources and time, and you'll get a large amount of impact for those resources and time that you put in. Yeah, so, and to link this back clearly, I'm talking about this being about the moral circle, I see this as a key project of moral circle expansion, right? Expanding humanity's moral circle to consider these beings sufficiently so that their needs are sufficiently considered, essentially, and they are not suffering in the horrendous intensity and scale that they currently are. Okay, so I've been making a case for that. I'm going to sort of take a bit of a step back. So I'm going to stop talking for a second. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to have a read of that. Okay. So if you're not familiar with this sort of mathematical notation, the 16 there in 10 to the 16 human lives of normal duration and 10 to the 34 biological human life year in the future accessible universe means those smaller numbers mean the number of zeros, right? I could not tell you without Googling it what those numbers, how you say those numbers. They are so terribly large. So I've been making the case that the scale of factory farming is a massive problem, right? And now I am saying to you that the scale, I couldn't resist putting these numbers on a graph, that the scale of the future of humanity just absolutely dwarfs this issue of factory farming, or at least factory farming in 2019. Sorry, I mean. Yeah. You can't even see the factory farmed land animals on this graph. There are so many zeros in that total future human lives estimate from Nick Bostrom there. So, yeah, so the point I'm getting at here is that with all that, yeah, this factory farming is a massive problem, right? I've been making the case that it's large, it's neglected, it's tractable. But I also made the case earlier that I think that humanity's moral circle is going to continue to expand. And so I think by this, what this means is that factory farming will, at some point, it's fairly likely, it's not absolutely guaranteed, but it seems pretty likely that it will come to an end, right? Because humans will, for technological reasons, like the development of animal food technologies, and for social reasons, they will factory farm will come to an end. So you might say, okay, in that graph, I was talking about factory farmed land animals in 1 year. That seems a weird thing to compare to future lives. So let's say, okay, what about if factory farming continues to exist for, say, about 100 years, right? Well, I plotted that on the graph as well, and you can't even see it. It's so tiny compared to the scale of total future human lives. Yeah. So, again, that's just that if we adjust our estimates and think that factory farming will continue to exist for not just 100 years, 1,000 years, you're just adding 1 zero against many, many zeros of total future human lives, and it's still absolutely dwarfed, right? Ignore that side. So that leads me, this all leads me to the conclusion that because the scale of the future is so massive, even small likelihoods of having an impact on changing the future for human lives for better or worse would just be more important than having a high certainty of having an effect on factory farming in the short or medium term, essentially. And it leads me to this view of long-termism. And so this is a definition from the Global Priorities Institute, which is a part of Oxford University. which of the term long-termism, which is the view that the primary determinant of the differences in value of the actions we take today is the effect of those actions on the very long-term future. In other words, the stuff that matters is the implications of your actions for the long-term future. If you, essentially, to summarize what this might imply for factory farming, if you're helping a chicken reduce, changing a chicken's circumstances from caged conditions to free range, the main effect is not the effect on that chicken or the chickens in that factory farm. It's the effect it might have on whatever indirect effects you think that might have on the long-term future, which hopefully we'll be able to dive into a bit more. So I just want to point out as well at this point, I've been focusing quite a lot on some of the on the negatives of factory farming, right? But if we buy this argument that the long-term future is massive and the primary determinant of actions is the effect on the long-term future, it's also worth pointing out that with vast scale comes vast opportunities, right? Especially if you, in your model system, you might weight these things differently. But certainly there's a substantial community of people who think that the future is likely to be fantastic for humans. That if you think human lives are on average positive now, then what is it going to be like in the future when we have better technologies? We can change people's lives in various ways. And this is especially a position advanced by people associated with the transhumanist movement, which I think is rebranded to H+, or they just have the logo H+ or something. But yeah, this is a logo that represents that. Okay, so yeah, there are those possibilities for future, sort of an amazing future with huge numbers of beings, human or otherwise, experiencing a positive future. But there are also the risks of astronomical suffering on a unbelievably massive scale, essentially. So this is a post by somebody called Brian Tomasic. Unfortunately, I took this screenshot late last year, shortly before this organization rebranded. You can find them by Googling Foundational Research Institute, but they're now called the Center on Long-Term Risk. So this is a post on that website. And so I'm just going to talk through some key potential risk factors for suffering on a massive scale in the long-term future. So one plausible scenario is the spread of wild animals. So I'm going to give you a potted summary of a very complicated debate with lots of ethical considerations, right? But one potential risk factor is the spread of wild animals. The argument is that essentially there are different types of animals. Some animals, like humans, have a small number of offspring and they invest a lot of resources in supporting those offspring and make sure they have good lives. Well, that's not the goal. The goal is to reproduce and continue humanity's existence or the being's existence. But there are other types of animals that have a different sort of reproduction strategy, that they essentially have huge numbers of offspring and they don't invest very many resources in each individual. And what that means in practice is that a lot of these animals live very short lives and they die very quickly. And they die from horrible things. They die from predation, starvation, disease. And the argument is that essentially, if this is happening in a widespread enough fashion, you might come to the view that animal lives, on average, or in total, whichever way you think is more important to think of it, in the wild are essentially negative. It would be better if those animals were not living, basically. Okay, I appreciate that that's a big topic that I'm happy to delve into a little bit more in the Q&A, but I'm going to essentially move on. The argument is that if you buy this argument that they are having negative lives on average or in total, and then in the future there are plausible scenarios in which these animals could spread, and that could involve terraforming, which is humans essentially colonizing other planets. That seems like one potential scenario in which we could spread wild animal suffering on a massive scale. Oops. Okay, another one, not involving animals directly, but other forms of sentient beings that are essentially artificial sentient beings. So human computing power is developing really rapidly, really massively, and this presents the possibility that some forms of artificial being will be sentient, that they can experience negative experiences, suffering, potentially positive experiences as well, right? And as computing power continues to grow, you could think that in hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of years, whatever, there could be this capability for, essentially unimaginably large numbers of simulations. This is kind of tied into the next simulation, right? Where the computer can just run lots of different simulations, and it might do that to learn. It might do that to sort of understand human nature better, or understand how it can achieve whatever goal it's set out to goal. So it might run lots of experiments where humans are created and something happens to them, and then they die almost immediately afterwards. Computers learned what it needed, or not just death. There could be scenarios in which they experience suffering for other reasons. And you've also got this I was going to say opportunity, not the right word, this risk factor of suffering subroutines. So this is the idea that essentially there are parts of the computer, the artificial intelligence, or that are complicated enough that we would consider them potentially worthy of, they have some experience. They can have positive, negative experience. They're worthy of some moral consideration, even though it's not obvious that they should do, right? Because of advances in computing power, this could happen on an absolutely massive scale. And then the last one that Tomasic mentions in this post are black swans, which is essentially like, these are three things that Brian Tomasic, who's an extremely intelligent person, came up with, right? He was, well, that's probably not true. Probably people have said these things before, some of them before at least. But he was able to come up with, or like collect these ideas in this post. But there's a ton of other things that could potentially happen that could be awful, and awful on a massive scale that we haven't considered. And the black swans is used to represent that. Okay, so I made this number up. Do not look at this graph too long or too hard. It's just to demonstrate the idea that if we think that this massive computing power could create these beings on a horrendous scale, and they could be suffering intensely, the scale could dwarf total future human lives, right? Because they could be easier to create or fill the universe with, or whatever. So, okay. So I haven't talked so much about neglectedness or tractability, and again, I'd be happy to dive into some of that stuff in the Q&A. But I think the key point here is just the consideration of the key part I get across here is that if you consider these beings as potentially morally important, and yet also potentially excluded from humanity's moral circle, or an artificial intelligence's moral circle, that they're just not sufficiently protected, that their interests are not looked out for, that these beings could be exploited, or not intentionally exploited, just incidentally suffering on a unimaginable scale, and it could just dwarf essentially all past misery. It could just be nothing compared to that, and could outweigh the sort of all positive experience at the time. So there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm going to just take for now that you follow my argument and that you agree that this seems like a massive problem that needs addressing somehow. So in terms of this idea of tractability, what can we do about it? There's a lot of uncertainty there, what the best things to do are. One way of summarizing some of the debates that have been going on in this space are the broad versus narrow consideration. How do we address these problems? Do we do it by essentially targeting doing something very targeted, or something much broader? So this is a presentation from somebody called Nick Beckstead, who, I think I'm right in saying, currently works for Open Philanthropy. Yes, examples of highly targeted proposals include doing technical research which will help to build a friendly AI, right? So you're thinking, here's a risk factor, or here's a thing that could lead to a positive future or a negative future. I'm going to do some technical research to make it less likely that specific outcome will happen. There's some other examples. And at the other end of the spectrum, on some pretty broad proposals, you have things like advocate for effective altruism, so that people care more about doing good, or think more about how to do the most good, or whatever it is. It's basically saying we don't necessarily know what the problem is, what the main problems are, or the most useful things we can do to address them. But in the meantime, whilst we're working it out, we're going to just spread this idea that we should really be focusing on the most important problems and doing it cost effectively, blah, blah, blah. And then there's stuff in between. And so, should I skip on to that? Yeah, I'll come back to some of the in-between stuff in a second. So, yeah, there's uncertainty, but currently well, especially I'd say a few years ago, but still to some extent, there is a fairly dominant focus in the effective altruism community on some of the more narrow approaches, especially artificial intelligence alignment with human values, artificial safety research, whatever you want to call it, that technical, narrow, highly targeted, sort of narrow proposal that I suggested before. At the top, that is a screenshot from 80,000 Hours, who are the sort of leading careers advice organization in the effective altruism community. And there they are arguing, yeah, basically they see technical problems. Oh, should have just read it out, but hey. Basically, it's something they prioritize greatly, and you'll see this on their key ideas page and at various points throughout their website. But also that organization that I quoted, who were actually outlining the risks of astronomical suffering, Foundational Research Institute, now Centre on Long-Term Risk, they also actually largely prioritize this fairly targeted proposal of addressing artificial intelligence. They don't necessarily focus on artificial intelligence alignment, they focus on fail-safe measures and some other proposals, but it's in a similar category of a highly targeted proposal. And so this is a research report by another researcher there. So where does the moral circle fit? Why do I think this is a useful thing to be doing? Well, let's go back to those risks of astronomical suffering that I brought up before from Brian Tomasic of the Centre on Long-Term Risk. Actually, yeah, he's not actually technically a researcher at the Centre on Long-Term Risk anymore. You just clarify that. So here's some different risk factors that he mentioned. Spread of wild animals, sentient simulations, suffering subroutines, and Prax 1. So artificial sentient beings or wild animals or something we don't know about, basically. And this is Sentient Institute's logo, if you're confused what that shape is. So essentially the point kind of the way the moral circle expansion might play into this is it's a broad intervention or a moderately broad intervention that might potentially address several of these different problems. If you think that one plausible pathway that Centre on Long-Term Risk have talked about in some of their research, one plausible pathway to these risks of astronomical suffering is that these beings are essentially not sufficiently considered because of whatever product of historical circumstances or potentially technological failure as well. They're not sufficiently considered and their interests aren't looked out for. They're not sufficiently protected. And that is going right to the heart of what I was talking about, this idea of the moral circle. They're not sufficiently included in humanity or artificial intelligence's moral circle. And so the project of expanding humanity's moral circle and taking the most effective approaches we can to expand that is essentially a broad project of reducing some of these different risks. And I'm kind of touching on this topic in this talk, and I'm tying it with some other stuff. But if you're super interested in some of the more specific ideas relating to this, I would thoroughly recommend this post by my colleague at Sentence Institute, Why I Prioritize Moral Circle Expansion Over Artificial Intelligence Alignment, which is on the Effective Altruism Forum. So, yeah. Oh yeah, I'll just read a short quote from that actually, because I think it's helpful to explain this. So as he writes, I think there is a significant chance that the moral circle will fail to expand to reach all sentient beings. And I think a small moral circle could very easily lead to suboptimal or dystopian far future. And you can have this view that a small increase in the chances of, because the scale is so massive, right? A small increase in the chances of humanity's moral circle being sufficiently broad to encompass these sentient beings fully, partly, a small chance just has massive implications if you in expected value terms, in the sense of kind of like, does it make sense? Does it look good in kind of probabilities? Like because when you sort of multiply those things together, the probability versus the size of the effect, then it still looks really promising because the scale of potential suffering is so massive. So you might be thinking, how does this actually translate? How does, for instance, work on farmed animals now translate into impacts for these beings, these future possible sentient beings. And one way it might translate is through this idea of the secondary transfer effect. And essentially, this is something I discussed briefly on this podcast with Christoph Don at the University of Kent, which you can listen to later if you're interested. But it's basically the idea that when consideration of one set of beings expands, it tends to expand for consideration of other sets of beings too. And there's a whole sort of fairly small, admittedly, but there's a body of psychological research which provides some evidence for this idea that expanding consideration of farmed animals could potentially expand consideration of other beings as well. There's also this idea that it could just free up resources, right? We could do some work, we could address the problem of factory farming, get that out of the way, and then we've got this big momentum of people caring about animals, caring about expanding moral consideration of sentient beings, right? So they could move from farmed animals to focusing on wild animals to focusing on some of those future sentient beings that don't necessarily even exist yet. Okay, so there's different ways you could think about this actually translating into impact for these sentient beings in the future. One could be that if you think there's a risk of human values getting sort of stuck at a particular point, and that could be for a number of reasons. It could be one example could be, for example, that a sufficiently powerful and intelligent, super intelligent artificial intelligence is created that basically from that point onwards, the values are locked in. So if you think that would say happen, let's just, let's imagine it happens in say 100 years, then the project of moral circle expansion is essentially about getting moral circles to be as wide as possible, as wide as is needed, I should say, before that lock-in happens. Because then after that, it's fixed, right? The scenario at the bottom with no advocacy, and then you can see sort of the gap in between the red and the blue lines after the lock-in happens. That could be the difference between astronomical suffering happening or not, or it could be the difference between degrees of suffering or something like that. But you don't have to think lock-in is necessary. It will necessarily happen to think this is a worthwhile project. Again, like I say, you could think of it of the probability of certain beings being considered, or like at least considered within a certain time frame or something like that. And there's lots of other ways. You could draw this graph in lots of ways. I noticed my colleague, after I prepared this, he'd made a similar presentation where he'd drawn better graphs than me. And there's lots of different ways you could sort of represent this theoretically. Yeah, so why did I put the slide? Yeah, okay, so I think this is just getting at the idea that to address this problem, we have to think that changing the course of history, shifting it from the red to the blue line is tractable, something that we can actually realistically achieve. And that's why I did that research on this post that I mentioned at the start, how tractable is changing the course of history, looked at some historical examples, looked at some social movement case study, sorry, not case studies, social movement theory, blah, 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 to think about this question. And long story short, it's quite a long post. I encourage you to read it if you're interested in the questions. But long story short, my conclusion was, yes, we can, but it's very hard. And I did a whole lot of presentation on that question, and I'm probably speaking for long enough as it is, so I won't go into that in too much depth. I actually gave that presentation in Oxford to the Global Priorities Institute that I mentioned earlier. So, yeah, so the question then, you might be thinking, okay, so Jamie's arguing that it's massive in scale, there's opportunities. I should also say that I'm not sure if I've got a slide on this, so I'll just shoehorn the point in now, that I think it's also massively neglected. If you define moral circle expansion in terms of anybody focusing on, say, farmed animals, then you might not think it's that neglected. But the project of really optimizing for moral circle expansion, that effect that could potentially have long-term future effects, is tiny. Arguably, it's Sentience Institute. And potentially some people at the Centre for Long-Term Risk or affiliated organisations. It's a tiny number. Yeah, it depends on your definitions, I guess. So yeah, I made the case earlier for factory farming. If you buy this question of the needing moral circle to encompass these potentially sentient beings, you might be thinking, what should we focus on now? What's the priority? Well, there's lots of different ways that you could pull on that lever of moral circle expansion that could have those knock-on effects that I was talking about. You could focus on addressing racism, addressing sexism, addressing homophobia and the stigmatization of the LGBTQI community. You could focus on addressing the neglect of future humans. I remember I put that on the board and it was a huge number. You could focus on addressing speciesism, the insufficient consideration of animals or other sentient beings. Essentially, you could address that directly. But within that, you can think farmed animals, wild animals, sentient artificial beings, even if they don't exist yet. Yeah, I'm sympathetic. And this is, again, there's a lot of uncertainty with all these questions, these massive questions. And I'm certainly sympathetic to the argument that we're not sure what the most cost-effective levers will be for pushing on this. So as an example, with some of the stuff on, I think I'll just summarise that my views are, I'm fairly unsure between these bottom three. I think they're more promising largely for reasons of neglectedness to date. Between farmed animals, wild animals, sentient artificial beings, I'm not sure. And I am currently doing a research project specifically on artificial sentience, thinking about trying to explore this question a bit more. But we are, we are now, and we have been for the past few years, focusing on this issue of farmed animal advocacy and ensuring that we can address this as, well, essentially help the farmed animal movement to be as effective as possible with a view to the long term. So this is, I'm going to just talk, I've kind of outlined the case. I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the practicalities stuff about what this implies. So Sentence Institute does a bunch of research. We have listed on our website what we call the foundational questions in effective animal advocacy. And you can see some examples at the bottom there. Things like confrontational tactics versus non-confrontational tactics. Should we focus on individual change, like individual dietary change, or institutional changes, like changing the way that companies and governments behave? And we've listed the evidence for and against that. These are sort of heuristic affect your advocacy or your views about which interventions are most cost effective. And this is probably one of my number one resource recommendations if you're interested in farmed animal advocacy. Check out and the next thing we do is we conduct research to better understand these questions. And we do this in a number of ways. We do essentially whatever we think is most useful for addressing that. We've done a bunch of historical research, which is essentially looking at an external body of evidence, right? There's all this historical evidence about what makes social movements effective. And we've started to look at some of that. So we've got a case study on the British anti-slavery movement, one on the US anti-abortion movement, the idea being that people advocating against abortion are trying to expand consideration of human fetuses. Whether or not you agree with the goals of these movements is almost irrelevant. We're looking for the strategic implications for movements that are trying to expand consideration of entities that are not themselves, right? So farmed animal advocacy movement is looking to expand consideration of farmed animals, not the advocates themselves, as opposed to, say, I don't know, some of the other movements I talked about earlier, like, say, the feminist movement is seeking to expand consideration of women. It's largely women driving the movement, not exclusively, obviously. We've also recently published a case study on the US anti-death penalty movement, and I've got one coming out fairly shortly on the US prisoners' rights movement as well. We've also done some historical research on technology adoption case studies, and this is about learning the strategic implications for the development of high-tech plant-based foods and cultured meat. So that's food grown from animal cells without requiring the slaughter of animals. And these are technologies that could essentially displace massive amounts of animal product consumption and facilitate the expansion of humanity's moral circle. So we're thinking about the ways to maximize the impact of those technologies and increase the likelihood that they successfully displace animal products. So I'll give you an example. I'll apply it to a particular question. So this is one of the questions that we have our most confident views on, I guess, from the foundational questions list that I flashed up on the screen. Are the most effective interventions and efforts to reduce animal suffering focused on asking individuals or institutions, so that's companies, government bodies, etc., to change their behaviour? Oh, and that's a photo from Oxford. That is Oxford VegSoc handing out animal equality leaflets. That's my co-founder at Oxford VegSoc. Sorry, that was just a brief aside. Nostalgia. Okay. Yeah, so this is a piece of research that we did that shed some light on that question. It's a survey of US attitudes towards animal farming and animal-free food from 2017. And we've recently done another version of this with some more questions that will come out later this year. And it's very surprising because if you think how many people are vegetarian or vegan in the US, it's almost definitely somewhere under 5%. But if you ask people, do they support a ban on factory farming or a ban on animal farming, then the numbers are far higher than you might expect, and they were certainly higher than I would have expected, and I think that my colleagues expected. So nearly 50% for some of those questions. Oh yeah, sorry, I put the predictions there on the right. So they were higher than my colleagues predicted for the bottom two at least. So that's one example. And we can bring lots of different types of evidence to bear on this question of prioritizing individual diet change versus institutional. We can do studies and experiments directly for this question or directly for the animal advocacy issue. So that survey I just gave is an example. Another great example is there is some research by animal charity evaluators that looked at the effectiveness of leafleting to change people's diets and encourage them to reduce their consumption of animal products. And essentially this combined 6 different studies, and it found that the effect, found no statistically significant evidence of an effect. Basically, it suggests that it was actually the what's called a point estimate was actually slightly negative, suggesting that the net effect on diets was, if anything, more likely to be increasing people's animal product consumption. So yeah, you can have those sorts of direct tests of this issue, and then you bring in some of the wider evidence I was talking about. Some of those case studies that we've done, basically a lot of the most promising tactics, some of the most effective tactics in various different movements have seemed to have been on targeting institutions. So I'll just give one example from the British anti-slavery movement that boycott that I presented as a great success was actually nestled in between some legislative campaigns and votes in Parliament. It was very much about putting pressure on Parliament to change on legislators to vote for the abolition of slavery. It was a targeted boycott. It was of a particular product type. And then if you compare that, it was of sugar. And if you compare that to the abolitionist movement in the US, where the focus was on essentially creating this, boycotting all slave-made goods. And there was what was called I think it was called the Free Produce Movement. Apologies if I've got that wrong, which was, essentially just a tiny movement and didn't really make much progress, partly because it was so demanding. And so essentially we find again and again that people seem to be more willing to support these sorts of wider institutional societal changes than they are to actually make an individual substantial behavioural change themselves. Yeah, and there's some more indirect evidence on this from psychology. You've got this idea of moral outrage, which plays into this idea that basically people are happy to project blame onto something else, onto the government, onto a company because they're doing bad things. Whereas if you confront people with information that their own behaviours are negative, sometimes you see this thing called the backfire effect, which is where people basically, rather than moving in their direction you expect them to move after showing them this evidence, they actually move in the opposite direction for various psychological reasons. And it's not exactly 100%, but there's a bunch of evidence suggesting that this may happen. Okay, so yeah, just narrowing in on, just sticking with this question of institutional versus individual tactics, I should probably summarise, as I say, that this is one of the questions we're more confident on. We basically think the farm down movement has massively neglected institutional tactics. The split at the moment is something in the realm of, if you just crudely divide into institutional versus individual, it's something in the realm of like 60 or 70% individual focused, and we would much prefer to reverse that ratio and increase the number of institutional tactics. So yeah, just some examples of individual tactics are things like leafleting, online ads, video stalls, and then institutional tactics include things like corporate welfare campaigns, corporate campaigns to increase the number of vegetarian and vegan products, lobbying and tactics targeting legislators, and you can make a variety of asks. I'm not going to spend longer on this actually, because I wrote a post about this since I prepared this presentation called, again, I forgot the name, but it's something like, which institutional tactics can we use? And it just goes through some of these in a bit more depth. So if you're just if you're thinking, what is he actually talking about? What does he mean by institutional tactics? Then I would encourage you to check that out on our blog. I've been talking mostly about the kind of strategic perspective from the movement's view and some of the research that we've done on that question. And you might be sitting there thinking, great, you've been telling me that there's all these problems and that the movement needs to do this. But Jamie, what should I do? What should I do as an individual? And there are plenty of different actions that you can take, right? One, arguably very easy action that everybody can take to some extent, or at least a lot of people listening to this talk could take, if not everybody in the world, right, is donate money. If not now, then you can then later. And this is essentially a big bottleneck for farmed animal advocacy organizations. So donating money can go a long way, especially if you take some of those estimates, like Samus's estimates earlier on at face value, that you can affect a large number of animals for a small amount of money. And if you buy my argument that some of these things have positive flow-through effects onto the long-term future, you can do a huge amount of good for a relatively small amount of money. And Animal Charity Evaluators, the organization I've screenshotted at the top, have some recommendations out there that you can use as a starting point, if not endpoint, of thinking about where your money can do the most good for animals. Yeah, I would also encourage a consideration of the foundational questions summaries thing that I put up before from Senders Institute, especially to think about the long-term flow-through effects. But yeah, that's a great resource. And yeah, in the middle there, and another action you can take rather than donating your money is you can think about, what are you going to do longer term? What is it you should be optimizing for with your time and your resources more generally over the rest of your career, the rest of your life, essentially? And so, yeah, there's some support out there on this question. And as I mentioned at the start, I co-founded this organization, Animal Advocacy Careers, and we will be launching a bunch of online public content to help people decide between different potential career paths in this space in hopefully about 2 weeks. Could be a week or so either side, but it's very soon. So yeah, go on our website, sign up to our newsletter, and join the Effective Animal Advocacy discussion Facebook group and stuff like that, so you can stay up to date with new research and content that comes out on this. Yeah, we're also going to be doing a bunch of other things like one-to-one careers advising calls, where you can basically have a longer conversation with me about what might be the best option for you in terms of maximizing your positive effect for animals and on the long-term future via moral circuit expansion, if you're interested in that. And yeah, we rely a lot on advice, on research and advice from this organization, 80,000 Hours, I mentioned earlier, even though I don't necessarily share every aspect of their cause prioritization thinking. So yeah, put that in as well. They're a great organization. Okay, I've talked a lot. So I'm going to summarize some key takeaways from this talk. I think the scale of the far future is enormous, right? It almost dwarfs, yeah, thinking about the impact of your future, thinking about the long-term future, the problems and the potential positives in the future just dwarfs present-term considerations, basically. Yeah, something I haven't talked very explicitly about, but I was talking about the idea of uncertainty between what's most effective for addressing the long-term, for improving the value of the long-term future, basically, broad versus narrow, moral circuit expansion versus technical research versus lots of other plausible things, even within moral circuit expansion, variations. And so, yeah, this is a plea to remain open to cause or intervention prioritization, basically, that we don't know what's best yet. And so as we do more research, as we understand these things better, our minds could change, and we should be willing to switch our focus to whatever we think will be the best use of our time resources for, yeah, for doing the most good in the long term. And some of you might have come in thinking, yep, definitely going to work on farmed animal issues, or definitely going to work on AI technical research, and maybe some stuff in this talk or some other resources that you'll read afterwards will encourage you to change your mind on that slightly. I'm not saying that you should, because I think both those things are useful, but encouraging you to remain open to that possibility. yeah, and because of that uncertainty, I think one important thing is that we have what I call a, I don't know why I said that, lots of other people call this as well, a sort of portfolio of different strategies to address the long-term future. We have moral circle expansion alongside some of the more technical things. I keep using those two examples, but there's a range of other things that could be done to improve the value of the long-term future. And yeah, if you want content on other potential cause areas and interventions to address the long-term future, 8,000 hours is a good place to go. And as individuals, I think we should focus on wherever we think we can have the greatest impact, wherever we can do the most cost-effective actions compared to the counterfactual. What would have happened if we weren't taking that? And yeah, last summary point, that I think the broad cause area of moral circle expansion, especially a focus on farmed animals, seems likely to be highly cost-effective on both short-term and long-term timeframes. I guess I haven't actually talked that much in this talk about how I talked a bit about the mechanisms, but what some of the long-term considerations might imply for farmed animal advocacy. So happy to delve into that in the Q&A if people are interested. Yeah, before I hand over to the Q&A, I'm going to put up a bunch of resources, and I think it would please me greatly if you would pick one or two, but probably just one activity or resource that you'd really like to use or do or look up, and plan a time when you'd like to actually use it and do it. Don't just, basically this is a encouragement to not let this talk just be an interesting thing you heard once, or boring maybe, but not let this talk just be a thing that you heard one day. It's a thing that you continue to revisit and adjust your views as appropriate. So yeah, I'm going to flash up some things and pick at least one that you think is most useful and put it in your diary, put it in your calendar, put it in your to-do list, whatever it is, however you organize yourself. It doesn't get from. So first, my essentially top recommendation, if you're interested in farmed animal advocacy specifically, or you're probably interested in that at least, is this summary of evidence for foundational questions in effective animal advocacy. Yeah, on the sort of strategic perspective and the sort of heuristics we would have about which interventions are most effective, what actions are most effective. And if you prefer book format, then you might enjoy this book by my colleague, called The End of Animal Farming, yeah, which is available from Amazon, all the places you'd expect. And then that slide I had before, if you're thinking about not just getting your head around the strategic considerations, but actually getting cracking and taking some action and looking for recommendations about how to do that most effectively, here are those organisations I mentioned before: Animal Charity Evaluators, Animal Advocacy Careers, and 8,000 Hours also on careers advice, but from a more sort of cause neutral, and they've more detailed in other respects. If you're interested in this question of cause prioritization, not just strategic within farmed animal advocacy or thinking what you can do as an individual, but getting your head around this question of what should we as a community be focusing on, you as an individual be focusing on in terms of broad cause areas, then good places to start are Centre for Effective Altruism. Their section on resources, I think, is a great introduction to these things, even if some of the articles are a little outdated. Yeah. Then there's 8,000 Hours. I mentioned before, they have these, what they call the problem profiles, which are summaries of the sort of different causes you might consider to be cost-effective, opportunities for cost-effective actions. And then the EA Forum post I mentioned before, by Why I Prioritize Moral Circle Expansion Over Artificial Intelligence Alignment, which is essentially how more detail on some of the things I've been touching on in this talk. Yeah, so here's a list of all those things. I'm not expecting you to write down the URLs now. Hopefully we can just share the slides afterwards, and if you can't find those things from Googling, then you can just come back and actually click on the URLs from here. So yeah, hopefully you picked one and wrote it down, but there won't be a test of whether you did or didn't. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Julia to pick some of your questions. But if you have to go now, please finish that survey that I asked you to start. It'd be really helpful and interesting to me how, if at all, this has changed your views. So yeah, please fill that out. But otherwise, yeah, look forward to some questions. And thanks again for listening.
Cool. There are a couple of questions here. I think I'll start by just asking the ones that have been most upvoted. So that's still something you can, attendees can do. You can upvote questions you want to hear the answer to, and you are likely to hear it, basically. So first question is, what do you think has been the main cause driving moral circle expansion historically? Is it intellectual progress, greater dispersion of power, or changing modes of production? There's also a second part to the question, which is, why should we expect moral circle expansion to continue?
Okay, those are both good questions. I feel like I can't give a good answer, mainly because I have a really bad memory. And I did do some research on this, like I say. I guess I didn't really spend a huge amount of effort trying to evaluate between them in terms of thinking what I think the main driver is. Yeah, it's tempting to just come up with an answer on the spot, but I think it would be an awful answer. So I'm going to just duck out and say, have a look at that post as a starting point if you're interested. And yeah, there's plenty of others. There's some other stuff on this. Global Priorities Institute would be interesting they have some content relating to this as well. And JC's book, End of Animal Farming, has some stuff on that. Why should we expect it to continue? Well, yeah, I listed the historical evidence there. I think there's other long-term factors. Basically, at the bottom of that post on how factors change in the course of history, I just compiled a big list of things for and against about whether you should expect it to continue. The most salient thing in my mind is that historical evidence, but there's quite a few different bullet points, and yeah, like I say, got a rubbish memory, so have a look if you're interested. Apologies, that was a real cop-out answer, but there you go.
Second question. I've seen some very negative reactions when anyone compares the moral consideration of animals to the moral consideration of women and minority groups in society. Admittedly, this seems to be at least partly due to speciesism. Any comparison between humans and animals is interpreted as an unspeakable insult. How do you navigate this when talking about moral circle expansion with members of the public?
Good question. So I couldn't give you a good answer in terms of how I navigate in dealing with the public, because we don't really do a huge amount of real public facing stuff. Like, we're not speaking on the news at 6 o'clock or something. We're doing most of our stuff is targeted at academics and people aspiring effective altruists. So yeah, it's definitely something that I find concerning, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the best way to deal with it is, because in terms of just the sort of personal logic, the personal logic is that there's a comparison to be made in terms of the implications, right? In terms of there's groups of humans, groups of entities, groups of beings that are worthy of moral consideration that are being excluded, and we're thinking about ways to ensure they are sufficiently considered. And yeah, so you can see it as part of the same sort of broader project. You can draw sort of strategic lessons between them, all that sort of thing. Yeah, in terms of ways to ensure that it doesn't come across as offensive, I don't really know the best way to do it. I try and just emphasize those reasons for it. But it's definitely something that concerns me, and I'm very open to suggestions about how to navigate that problem. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Cool. What are your thoughts on a potential hierarchy of moral circle expansion according to different animals, depending on levels of sentience / consciousness? For example, many people see insects as less sentient or less conscious, so less worthy of moral consideration.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure what you mean in terms of potential hierarchy of moral circle expansion. In terms of a hierarchy of different beings, yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways you could approach this. So one way of thinking about it is essentially that you can see consciousness as something like a binary, right? Organisms are conscious or they're not. yes or no. And then with that approach, you might look at something like a chimpanzee and say, okay, what's the chances that this organism, this being is conscious, and therefore I should care about it? Then you might assign a probability to that, right? So you wouldn't look at it and say definitely 100% conscious, because you don't necessarily know. You'd assign a probability. And so what that implies is that, like, say you think chimpanzees are 90% likely to be conscious, is that essentially you should, in some ways, you could think of it almost as if it had the same value as if you were doing those things for a human, but you discount it by 10%, right? So you kind of times it by 0.9. To think about how useful that action is. That's the sort of how this plays out practically, I think, at least, if you do that. Arguably, consciousness and then moral weight are separate things, but if you treat them as separately, then you could also just add another multiplier in where you times chimpanzee by like something else that means it's like less than human, whatever. That's kind of the probability of consciousness approach is something that's been explored by a number of people, but there's a great research report by Luke Moorhauser of Open Philanthropy that came out, I think, 2017, on essentially the probability that Moorhauser assigned that these different beings were conscious. And yeah, it's got a lot of appendixes because it's a very complicated topic. But another approach that you could have would be, so this is more along the lines, and this is, I'm certainly not a neuroscientist. I don't know very much about this at all. I don't have very strong views at all. I'm just sort of summarizing how other people have approached this problem. But other people approach it by, they don't see consciousness as a binary. They see essentially a question of, you can think of like beings as being made up of things that we might care more or less about. So you might look at an ant and say, yeah, an ant doesn't have like as developed a brain or whatever as a human, but it does have some things I care about. Like there's some sort of response mechanism, there's some sort of process going on here. I care about those things. And so, yeah, it's only got a few of those things rather than tens or hundreds or whatever for other beings. But you care about it to some extent, albeit a lesser extent. And so, yeah, that approach of essentially splitting up the idea of sentience into different sub-factors is probably especially amenable to the idea of what I was talking about earlier, of there being the chance of sentient subroutines and like sections of a computer that are sentient. So yeah, there's those different approaches. In some ways, I think that what they imply about like expected value calculations, what can you do to have the greatest impact, they have quite similar implications, because you're basically just multiplying your action by something less than 1 to think about how impactful it is. Like you're timesing it by 0.1 or something to make it so that you're like, okay, well, either you might say, for instance, this insect has 10% chance of being 10% chance of being conscious, or you say, well, I only assign 10% as much moral weight to all these things as I do to this various functions within a human. So yeah, I think in some ways the implications are the same there. If your question was getting at like what is the order, I don't know a ton about it, but I can summarize that the views tend to be something like humans at the top or near the top, and then things like chimpanzees closer, and then you've got various mammals. Then people put like chickens and fish lower down, and then there's insects, and then you get down into things like nematodes and these like things that are massive in number in the world at present, but it's much harder to tell like is there anything morally valuable going on there. Yeah, so yeah, if you're interested in that, like I say, Luke Moorhauser's report for Open Philanthropy, and on the sort of splitting consciousness up into different sections stuff. JC has a post about this on our website, on the blog, and there's also a bunch of writings by Brian Tomasic, who I mentioned earlier, at the Centre, Foundational Research Institute, and his personal website that addresses that question.
From the perspective of prioritizing moral circle expansion, what are your views on career accelerating meat substitution vis-a-vis pushing for veganism / banning factory farming? Could meat substitution hinder moral circle expansion in the long term? For example, as a thought experiment, if we were to develop cultured human meat or plant-based meat mimicking human meat, that would seem morally abhorrent.
Um, okay. Yeah, sorry, I was fixating on the last part because I haven't, I don't think anyone's ever suggested that to me. Um, yeah, my initial reaction to that is that that would actually facilitate moral circle expansion anyway, because it would break down the apparent barriers between humans and other sentient beings. So yeah, apologies, not a huge amount to say on that specific question at the end. But on the thing about meat substitution via, oh sorry, I'm just rereading this. Okay. Yeah, no, I definitely think that. Sorry, I thought you were asking about animal-free food and animal-free food tech and that sort of thing. I definitely think that pushing for meat substitute is a positive. Basically, there have been, like I mentioned, some of that stuff about the secondary transfer effect and some of the psychological experiments. There's evidence that suggests that if people don't eat meat, they're more likely to sufficiently consider sentient beings. So, for example, there was, I'll sort of crudely summarize a couple of some experiments that have been done on this. One was people were randomized to either be given, I can't remember the exact context, I think they're university students, randomized to either be given some nuts as a snack or some bits of meat as a snack. And then they were just fill out a survey afterwards. People who ate the meat had like significantly lower ratings of the capabilities and of animals than the people who ate the nuts as a snack, suggesting that there's some psychological processes there that basically mean that you deny you sort of you sort of justify your behavior presumably, or potentially some other reasons why this is happening, but people basically after consuming animal products attribute less moral capability or moral worth to animals. And then another experiment on this was an experiment or just a survey? I think it might have been a survey where they basically asked people to rate different types of animals, and there was like they gave them quite a few different types of animals. I think again it was like the mental capacities of these animals. I could be misremembering it. Essentially, it seems that humans assigned lower values to animals associated with farming than they did to otherwise very biologically similar animals. So, for instance, I can't remember the exact examples, but say you've got like two quite similar mammals. One of them is commonly farmed, one of them isn't. People would, on average, assign much lower mental thought. These animals have lower mental capabilities because it's that same sort of process. So all this leads me to believe that if people are not eating animal products, they're not confined. Animals aren't confined in factory farms. The discussion around this, the views around it is kind of like, yes, we managed to move past the factory farming. We've managed to progress beyond that now. We have these other systems that provide us with food. Then people are kind of freed up to consider animals sufficiently, right? So yeah, and this is essentially our goal for the past few years, is ending animal farming. So yes, I think it's great from the perspective of moral circle expansion. Could it hinder it? Yeah, sorry, I haven't. Yeah, there are definitely some vaguely plausible mechanisms through which some things like this could cause negative long-term effects for moral circle expansion. Like if, for instance, I see some at least theoretically plausible, if not particularly likely, ways in which developing cultured meat could lead to a sort of entrenchment of values, or something like that, or some thinking around like exploitation or something like that. But again, they don't seem particularly likely to me. Cool.
How do you respond to long-termists who exclusively care about digital suffering in the far future? And why is it important to include non-human animals in our moral circle?
I'm not sure that's a very common perspective, is it? Like, do you mean people? If you mean people who exclusively care about so certainly there's a lot of people who don't assign moral value, or like they're just not that worried about these risks of astronomical suffering, and they're interested in like affecting artificial intelligence for the sake of human outcomes, right? Like preventing human extinction so that humans can live excellent lives. I could be wrong, but that seems. Yeah, I'd be surprised if that's a particularly common view, that there's people who care about this like very specific, hard to imagine form of digital suffering, but not non-human animal suffering. Actually, having said that, I think I did read the other day that Eliezer Yudkowsky, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, and someone thinks that like some complicated artificial entities could be like that, and animals don't have sufficiently complicated systems or whatever. So yeah, maybe I'm underestimating the extent to which that is common. How do I reply to those people? I don't know. I'm not exactly a great great at personal persuasion of like you should care about this thing. I kind of just like present the information and then let people draw their conclusions. Not something I have a great go-to answer on that. Oh, I should say as well, actually, that like I'm not confident that we should actually be trying really hard to persuade people of things like that if they're not too sure, because I think that cooperation is a potentially extremely important value for the future as well. And this is something Centre on Long-Term Risk have written quite a lot about, and potentially a counter argument to moral circular expansion being a promising cause area as well. Sorry.
If cultured meat adoption one day becomes widespread, do you think this will help people to expand their moral circles to include non-human animals, even if they had other reasons to originally adopting cultured meat?
Cool. Yeah, that's the question I thought the other person was asking until we read it.
Yeah, I think it was similar. I didn't read it before I read it out.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, so like I was saying about some of those psychological experiments, I think basically like if the production of animal products is eliminated, then I think people will be sort of freed up to consider animals properly. I think in terms of one thing I'll drop in there, because this is a topic that comes up, but I think so basically depending if you have the short-termist or long-termist priorities, then it could lead to quite different views about the optimism of cultured meat and these sorts of things. So I'm going on a bit of a tangent from the question, but you might find it interesting. So, for example, if you're really, really short-term focused, you might look at cultured meat and say, oh, well, that might not be here for 30 years. Therefore, I don't care. I only care about animals alive right now. Some people do. I definitely don't. In which case, you might deprioritize cultured meat and you might prioritize plant-based meat instead if you think that's promising right now, or you might just prioritize welfare initiatives. But if you have if you have a slightly longer term priorities, then you might think, yeah, okay, this is promising. This is a promising way to increase the likelihood that factory farming is ended. That's certainly my view. There's also this question of like what the counterfactuals are. So these technical developments are essentially drawing in a lot of investment from the for-profit sector, right? Technology, as a general rule, tends to advance rather than regress. So you might think that basically this is a more efficient system. It's going to happen sometime. There could even be hundreds of years of delay because people discard it for some silly reasons, like it's not sufficiently natural or whatever. And you could think that, like, yeah, it's just fairly likely to actually eventually at least pan out because technology just keeps advancing. So from that perspective, you might want to prioritize some of the social advocacy around it, which is a substantial focus of this institute, of a bunch of other groups. Arguably, it's a large portion of the focus of the Good Food Institute, as opposed to actually directly doing the technical research. It's support for the likelihood that these technologies actually do replace products and do facilitate an expansion of humanity's moral circle in that sense. And yeah, if that question, I guess we haven't written anything up particularly in depth on that argument I just shared, but it is written at least briefly on our foundational question summaries. We have a section for social change versus technical change, technological change, what you should prioritize. But yeah, we'll leave that there.
I'm very interested in how humans form in-groups and out-groups. Have you heard of Billy Swan's concept of identity fusion? And do you see this as useful for moral circle expansion?
I haven't heard of that. That sounds like it could be relevant. Yes. Sorry, I can't give you a more interesting reply to that, but maybe I'll Google it later, or feel free to ping me an email or whatever.
The name moral circle somewhat implies that certain beings' inclusion in the moral circle will happen before others in a kind of sequential way. Do you think there might be a moral circle expansion invention that is, do you think there might be moral circle expansion interventions that are just broadly good for all groups of beings that currently are less within a moral circle? The sort of thing I'm thinking is some kind of direct moral circle expansion education or something similar.
Yeah, and I talked about those different groups and not being very confident about which is most likely to be most cost effective. Yeah, there are a number of, I guess, problems with the terminology of moral circle expansion. For instance, one that somebody who was like speaking to me for ages about this topic, and they were like, "But is it in or out?" And I was like, "Oh no, for me it's degrees. It's definitely degrees." But there are a number of ways in which it's not clear exactly what we mean. At Sentence Institute, we're quite empirically focused. Like JC's post about is why he prioritizes moral circle expansion over artificial intelligence research is essentially the most theoretical thing we have. So yeah, it's not something that I've spent a long time worrying about the precise terminology. We're doing the research about thinking to work out what we think the most effective strategies are. So yeah, I think definitely plausibly there could be some that are good for all groups. I doubt they'd be similar, like equally good for groups. I think it would probably still be, like maybe, but yeah, it kind of in terms of like, I don't think it has to be sequential. Like, oh, first we must bring this one slightly closer to the center, then the next one, then the outwards one. That's one way of approaching it, and it could be the most tractable and cost-effective way to make change. And that's one argument focusing on farmed animals. But I'm not convinced. Like, I don't know. I'm feeling vaguely optimistic at this point about some more direct efforts on artificial sentience, and that's partly why I've been excited to do this literature review that I'm working on now. But I don't want to say anything too confidently because I'm just dipping into the topic, basically. But yeah, I don't think it has to be sequential necessarily. Is a key point.
Do you think that the act of eating meat has measurable/estimable effects on moral circle expansion? I think you're right to point out that institutional tactics are more impactful, especially for long-termists. But should we care also about our individual acts?
Yeah, I think we should care about individual acts. Like, it's all part of the same process. I think, for instance, if a load of research came out that showed that there was like really cost-effective ways to change people's diets, then I would definitely shift my views about what the balance should be between individual and institutional. I don't think we should scrap individual change entirely. It's a key part of the process. As one example of how it's needed to some extent. If there needs to be at least some demand, like the early adopters or whatever, of new technologies, of new animal-free foods. If you had like people working on animal-free foods, but there was just no one who would there'd be no like individual marketing effort or whatever at all, then there would be no market and those products just wouldn't work, at least at the start. Yeah, I think there's definitely like individual change is beneficial. I think, for instance, if you're asking like as a long-termist, do I need to agonize about like the exact implications of like whether there was milk powder in the bottom of my whatever it was you're eating that day or not? I don't think it's that important, basically. I think you should prioritize worrying about more important things and like essentially your personal veganism, it matters relatively little compared to the effects you can have on others and institutions, because those stuffs just have the sort of effect size, the number of animals affected just much larger. That said, yeah, there's also stuff about like social norms, right? So arguably, you want to be clear about what your veganism, what it is or whatever, to set an example, because to show that it can be done and all those sorts of things. Let me just double check out that question properly. Does it have measurable, estimable effects? Well, this is obviously a big amorphous concept. It's very hard to measure precisely any of these things. Even these So if you take the example of the cost effectiveness estimate I flashed on the screen earlier from Saulus from about corporate welfare campaigns, basically part of the reason I love that post so much is because he does this like fairly precise seeming estimate. And then in the end, he's got this massive list of things that aren't included about why the cost effectiveness estimate just could be completely wrong or like not ideal or whatever. And yeah, it's essentially much easier to measure effects on short-term timeframes than it is to measure follow-through effects and indirect effects and all these other things that make it a very complicated picture. So you can do some ballpark like back of the envelope estimates and some like rough modeling and stuff. It's not something I'm very good at or have even really done or seen, but I suspect people have done them. Pretty sure JC has done something along those lines in the past for his own prioritization. So you could definitely come up with something. Just don't know how much it would tell you, basically, because it tends to be influenced by all these different factors. That there's this idea in effective altruism, if you're not familiar with, of crucial considerations, which is basically that when you're dealing with things that are massive in scale, you can think of one new thing that can basically flip the sign of what you're working on and thinking, oh, actually, that could be really negative because it has this effect I hadn't thought about, or actually, that's just not very important because this other thing has way more effect than I thought it would because the stakes are so high with everything we think about. So, yeah, you can come up with some numbers, but I don't expect you to have much confidence in them for very long.
Is it too early in history to encourage people to care about invertebrates? For example, do you think it would be possible to encourage the public to start caring about humane pesticides in the near future? Yeah,
interesting. Okay, so this is, I think, if you go from farmed animals to wild animals to artificial sentience, the summary is that like the scale gets bigger each time, but the ability just goes down massively. Well, sorry, the scale and the neglectedness makes it look more promising, but the tractability makes it look much less promising. And so how that actually pans out with all things considered, what's most cost effective on long-term timeframes is pretty uncertain. And that's why I was saying with those sorts of estimates in the previous question, you're left with this trade-off of like, how do I compare these? Just like one scores ridiculously high on one criteria, but ridiculously low on the other, and the other is like reverse. And then how does this pan out? Is hard to decide. So yeah, I basically think my current guess is that with each of them there are some opportunities for cost-effective sort of advocacy around this or institutional tactics or whatever. And yeah, sorry, I guess you asked about invertebrates as opposed to wild animals. I tend to lump invertebrates in with that, but obviously there's a bunch of invertebrates that are farmed or potentially farmed as well. And Rethink Priorities have been doing a bunch of research specifically about invertebrates and farmed invertebrates as well. So yeah, I don't think it's too early to at least be testing things out and working out like, are there opportunities? And I think with the example you gave there of humane pesticides, I think that's a great example of where one, you can get a sense of like, you can start getting a sense of the actors in the space. How do they respond to different things? And two, it's about starting to spread that social norm, that idea of this is worth intervening in. Because essentially the main objection you come up against this idea of we should focus on helping wild animals is people say, but doesn't that just go against nature? Like you're intervening in nature. And so, yeah, the question, well, I mean, people are intervening in nature all the time. Farming affects nature as it is. We're doing that currently. It's just a question of thinking how we want to affect nature. But there's relatively little precedent for direct intervention with the explicit goal of improving well-being of wild animals. So I think like just seeing how that goes and getting some and starting to spread that social norm is valuable. Depends how risk averse you are, I guess. If you think there's a substantial chance of it backfiring, then you could think that the negative effects would be just as bad. So I know I've kind of just said, here's some considerations for and against. My current view is essentially, no, I don't think it's too early, but we should play it fairly safe and try things on and see how they go.
I've got one last question. You suggested several times, I think, that that moral circle expansion is something that is like quite likely to actually happen in the future. Would that not present an argument for like an individual to perhaps not focus on it if they expect it to happen, even if they don't work on it? So they could like work on something else because that's something that's like going to happen and turn out right anyway, even though it's like a very good thing that it will happen.
Yeah, interesting question. I don't think it does. I think that what matters is the effect you will have on the probability of something happening, basically, or potentially the speed it will happen if you're worried about lock-in. But say, for instance, like you could think that. So let's just focus on farmed animals for the sake of this discussion. So let's say you think that there's a 90% chance that the moral circle will expand to a sufficient degree to consider farmed animals and give them as much protection as you think is needed. Let's just go with that, like as a binary yes or no, 90% chance. Then you could still think that because that's so important, because it has all these important knock-on effects, blah, 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 that shifting 90% up to 92% is just as important as shifting it from, say, 10% up to 12%. Like an increase in 2% is an increase in 2%. The only reason in which, well, there's probably some like mathematical thing I'm missing here, but like the main thing that jumps to mind of why you might not think that that is the same is if you also think that the closer something gets to 100, it also, your heuristic, you basically have a prior or a heuristic or whatever, that also decreases tractability. So you might think it's harder to shift it from 90 to 92 than it is to shift it from 10 to 12, which I would probably agree with, but what I'm just saying is like there's no sort of inherent reason why something being quite likely already means that we should not think there are opportunities there. You can have a heuristic about that, but I don't think it's like a fixed, unless it's like literally 100%, which nothing is, because then there's nothing you can do.
Yeah. Those were all of the questions that have been asked.
Cool, they were good questions. I thoroughly enjoyed them.
Cool, thank you so much for the talk and for answering the questions. And to everyone who's watching, I'm going to post contact details. I think your email. If there are other questions you have and you want to contact Jamie about, I'll post it in the Facebook event.
Sounds good. I'd be keen to share the slides because, like I say, a lot of the resources are on there. And I also just want to do a last plug in case you listen to all of this and you haven't already. Fill out my survey, please. It'd be helpful. I'd like to see how people respond to this. And if you, I'd be interested in your thoughts generally about what responses to this and that sort of thing. So, and also thanks very much again for organising and thanks for everybody for coming.